There's a town with more than 200 witches, and the craziest part is, it's real, not a movie. The town is Salem, Massachusetts in the US, and it's famous for a ton of creepy horror stories and haunted legends. People talk about terrifying houses with weird noises, spooky touches that visitors feel out of nowhere, and a general vibe that gives you chills. There's also Old Burying Point Cemetery, one of the oldest graveyards in the United States, and it's home to the grave of Judge Hathorne, known for his terrifying presence and haunted atmosphere. There are cities that remember, not the way a library remembers, quiet, organized, pages waiting to be opened. The way a wound remembers, the way a body remembers something that was done to it before the mind had words for what was happening. Salem, Massachusetts is one of those cities. It sits on the northeastern coast of America, 30 miles north of Boston, on a harbor that has been receiving ships since before the country that surrounds it had a name. The streets are old, the houses are old, the stones in the ground are old, and underneath all of it, underneath the tourists and the gift shops and the October festivals and the witch museums and the ghost tours and the decorative broomsticks in the restaurant windows, underneath all of that, something has been waiting for a very long time. Not patiently. Patiently implies acceptance. What waits in Salem does not accept. It persists. There is a difference. This is the story of what Salem is, not what it says it is, not what the tourism boards say, not what the history books say, though the history books come closer than anything else, because the history books contain things that most people read once and then set aside because the full weight of them is difficult to carry for very long. This is the story of what the city did, what it does, what it is still doing. Pay attention to the details. They all come back. Before Salem was Salem, it was a place the Naumkeag people had lived in for thousands of years. They called the area by a name that colonists later compressed and altered until it became the word we use now. The land along the harbor was fertile. The fishing was good. The forests were full. Then the ships came. The English arrived in the 1620s, and by 1626 a permanent settlement had been established on the neck of land between two rivers. They named it Salem, a derivation of the Hebrew word shalom, meaning peace. Peace. Hold on to that. The Puritans who settled Salem had come to the New World for a specific reason. They believed they were building a holy community, a society governed directly by the laws of God, a city on a hill that would serve as a model for all of Christian civilization. They were serious people, educated in many cases, deeply, genuinely devout. They believed in Scripture with a totality that is difficult to fully imagine now. And they believed, with equal totality, in the devil. Not as a metaphor, not as a symbol of human weakness, as a real, active, present force in the world. An enemy with agency and intelligence, and a specific interest in corrupting the souls of the faithful. The Puritans believed that Satan was especially interested in their community precisely because they were trying to build something holy. You don't attack what doesn't matter to you. This belief was not fringe. It was not the belief of the uneducated or the unstable. It was the consensus of the most respected theological minds of the era. Increase Mather, president of Harvard College, believed it. His son Cotton Mather, one of the most influential ministers in colonial New England, believed it. The governors believed it. The judges believed it. The entire apparatus of power in Massachusetts Bay Colony believed that the devil was real, present, and looking for a foothold. And so when the foothold came, when the first girl screamed and the first accusation was made, the structure that was supposed to protect people became the structure that destroyed them. That is the first thing to understand about Salem. The horror did not come from outside the community. It grew from the inside. The winter of 1692 was hard. It had been a bad few years in Massachusetts Bay Colony. King William's War, a conflict between England and France that spilled into the American colonies, had been grinding on since 1689, sending refugees flooding into Essex County from burned-out settlements to the north. The colony was under political pressure. Its original charter had been revoked, and a new governor was on his way but hadn't arrived yet, leaving a vacuum of authority. There had been smallpox. There had been drought. There had been raids from neighboring Native American tribes, brutal and sudden, leaving communities with a persistent sense of vulnerability that never fully resolved. And in the household of Samuel Parris, the minister of Salem Village, a rural community a few miles inland from Salem town, two girls began to behave strangely. Betty Parris was 9 years old. Her cousin Abigail Williams was 11. They lived in the Parris household along with a woman named Tituba, an enslaved person from Barbados who served the family. In January of 1692, Betty and Abigail began having fits. They screamed. They threw things. They contorted their bodies into positions that frightened the people who watched. They said they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. They crawled under furniture. They barked. The local doctor, William Griggs, examined them and concluded, in the language of the time, that the evil hand was upon them. Witchcraft. Betty and Abigail were asked who was tormenting them. They gave 3 names. Tituba, the enslaved woman. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who wandered the village asking for food and shelter. Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had stopped attending church and was engaged in a property dispute with the family of one of the accusers. 3 women on the margins of society. Exactly the kind of people whose accusations were easiest to believe. The examinations began on February 29th in the Salem Village Meeting House, before magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. The courtroom was packed. The afflicted girls were present. When the accused women were brought in, the girls fell into fits, screaming, convulsing, crying out that they could see the accused's spectral form attacking them even as the accused stood still before the court. This was spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted about what they saw in visions and dreams. Invisible attacks, spirit shapes, things that could not be photographed or documented or cross-examined, things that existed only in the minds of the accusers. The court accepted it as valid. That decision, that single procedural choice, is what turned 3 accusers into a machine. Because once spectral evidence was accepted, there was no defense against it. You could not disprove a vision. You could not cross-examine a dream. You could stand in the dock and swear on your life that you had never practiced witchcraft, had never made a covenant with the devil, had never harmed these girls in any way. And it meant nothing, because the girls could simply point at you and scream and fall down, and the court would record it as evidence. The only thing that could save you was a confession. Confess that you were a witch. Name others. Cooperate with the court. And you would, in all likelihood, not hang. Which meant the safest thing to do, the only rational survival strategy, was to lie. To say you had done something you had not done. To accuse someone else of something they had not done. To feed the machine in order to survive it. And the machine grew. By March, Ann Putnam Jr. had joined the accusers. She was 12 years old. Her mother, Ann Putnam Sr., began accusing as well. Then Mary Walcott. Then Elizabeth Hubbard. Then Mercy Lewis. More names came with more accusations, and the accusations spread outward from Salem Village into the surrounding towns. Andover, Topsfield, Ipswich, Beverly, until more than 200 people had been named. 200 people. In a region with a total population of only a few thousand. The accused came from every level of society. At first, they were the expected targets, the poor, the elderly, the already marginalized. But the machine did not stay satisfied with easy targets. It moved upward. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, a grandmother, a respected member of her church, beloved in her community. She was accused. Her sisters were accused. John Proctor, a prosperous farmer who had publicly called the accusers frauds, was accused. And when he was accused, his wife Elizabeth was accused alongside him. George Burroughs, a Harvard-educated minister who had previously served in Salem Village, was accused of being the ringleader of all the witches in New England. And then, in a moment that should have stopped everything but didn't, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good was accused. Dorcas Good, 4 years old, examined, imprisoned, chained in the jail because the jailer was afraid of what a 4-year-old witch might do if left free. She was held for 8 months. She never fully recovered. That detail, a 4-year-old in chains, sits in the historical record like a stone at the bottom of a clear lake. You can see it. You cannot reach it. You cannot fully take in what it means about the people who put it there. These were not monsters. That is the unbearable part. They were ordinary people, frightened, devout, convinced they were doing the right thing. The jailer who chained the child was not a sadist. He was afraid. The magistrates who accepted spectral evidence were not corrupt. They were certain. The girls who accused their neighbors. Some of them were lying, and some of them believed every word they said. Fear, certainty, and a system that gave both of them the authority of law. 4. The court. In May of 1692, the new governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, Sir William Phips, arrived from England. He found a colony in crisis, the jails overflowing, the accusations multiplying, the entire social fabric of Essex County fraying under the weight of suspicion. He did what governors do. He created a special court to handle the situation. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, Latin for to hear and decide. It began its work in June. The first person it tried was Bridget Bishop. Bridget Bishop was in her late 50s or early 60s. She had been accused of witchcraft once before, years earlier, and acquitted. She ran a tavern. She wore a red bodice in a community where red was considered immodest. She was outspoken. She had been married 3 times. She denied everything. The court found her guilty on June 2, 1692. 8 days later, on the morning of June 10th, Bridget Bishop was taken through the streets of Salem town to a rocky ledge on the western slope of a hill at the edge of town. A sheriff's cart, a crowd of witnesses, the sound of the harbor in the distance, the smell of salt air and pine. She was hanged, and the court of Oyer and Terminer had its first execution. 5 more followed in July. Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Wilds. Their names are carved in granite now at the memorial on Proctor's Ledge. Their names are there because someone decided 300 years later that names in stone were the least the city could do. In August, 5 more, including George Burroughs, the Harvard minister, who recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly from the scaffold, something witches were supposedly incapable of doing. The crowd wavered. Cotton Mather, watching from horseback, calmed them with a speech about how the devil was capable of appearing as an angel of light, and that Burroughs' apparent piety was itself proof of his deception. They hanged him. In September, 8 more. And Giles Corey. Giles Corey was 80 years old. He was a farmer, a difficult man by most accounts, litigious, stubborn, known for a temper. He had, earlier in the crisis, testified against his own wife, Martha, when she was accused. He had said things in court that were used against her. Perhaps he regretted it. Perhaps that is why he made the choice he made. When Giles Corey was accused of witchcraft, he refused to enter a plea. In the English legal system of the time, a trial could not proceed without a plea of guilty or not guilty. A defendant who refused to plead could be subjected to a procedure called peine forte et dure, pressing, in which heavy stones were placed on the defendant's chest to force a response. The idea was that eventually the defendant would either agree to enter a plea or die. Giles Corey chose to die. He was taken to a field. He was laid on the ground. A board was placed over his chest. Stones were added one by one over the course of 3 days. They were heavy enough that he could barely speak. The sheriff, it is recorded, occasionally used his cane to push Corey's tongue back into his mouth when it protruded under the pressure. At various points, Corey was asked if he would enter a plea. His answer, recorded by witnesses and preserved in the historical documents, was always the same: more weight. He died on September 19, 1692. His wife, Martha, was hanged 2 days later. Why did he do it? Some historians believe it was a calculated legal maneuver. If he died without entering a plea, he could not be convicted, and his property could not be confiscated by the court. His estate would pass intact to his heirs, rather than being seized as the property of a condemned witch. That may be true, but there is another possibility. The simpler one. He was 80 years old. He had watched the court take person after person, his neighbors, his friends, eventually his wife, and find them guilty regardless of the evidence. He knew what a plea would mean. Guilty or not guilty, the outcome was the same. He had seen the machine work. He understood that there was no path through it that ended well, and so he chose the one path that the machine could not follow. He chose not to play. More weight. Those 2 words are the most defiant thing anyone said in Salem in 1692. They are also the most heartbreaking. An 80-year-old man telling his killers that they could press harder and it would not matter, that he was done cooperating with a system that had already decided. The stones are gone. The field is a parking lot now, but the weight of what happened there is still in the city, in the way weight stays in a body long after the thing that caused it is gone. 6. The voices. Nobody listened to. Here is what the history books don't always emphasize enough. People said something was wrong. From the very beginning, there were people in Salem who looked at what was happening and said clearly and directly that it needed to stop. Thomas Brattle was a Boston merchant and mathematician. In October 1692, he wrote a letter, later preserved and published, that systematically dismantled every aspect of the witch trials. He attacked spectral evidence. He questioned the methods of the court. He named the judges and the ministers who were supporting the process and argued that history would not be kind to them. He wrote with the clarity and precision of a man who had decided that the truth was worth the risk of saying it. Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's own father, the president of Harvard, wrote a treatise arguing that the standards of evidence used in the witch trials were insufficient. He is credited with the line that would become famous: "It would be better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that 1 innocent person should be condemned." He was right. The court kept going. Robert Califf was a Boston merchant who spent years after the trials collecting evidence of their injustice and eventually published a book in 1700, More Wonders of the Invisible World, that was a direct and detailed attack on Cotton Mather and the conduct of the trials. Cotton Mather's supporters reportedly burned copies of the book in the Harvard yard. They burned the book because the alternative was sitting with what the book said. And here is the thing that keeps coming back. The thing that makes Salem not just a historical tragedy, but something that resonates in a way that doesn't diminish with time. The people who saw the injustice and said so clearly were not ignored because they were wrong. They were ignored because the people in power had too much invested in being right. The court was not run by idiots. The ministers were not uneducated. The magistrates were not incapable of reason. They were capable of reason. They chose not to apply it, because applying it would have meant admitting that the 20 people who had already died had died for nothing, that the system had not been protecting the community from the devil, that the system had been the devil. That is a thing that is very hard to admit. And so instead of admitting it, they kept going, until they couldn't anymore. The machine broke the way machines usually break. It overreached. By September 1692, the accusations had climbed so high in society that they had begun to threaten people with genuine power. The wife of Governor Phipps was accused. Members of the Boston clergy were accused. A former governor, Thomas Dudley, had his name mentioned. When the accusations reached the powerful noticed that the evidence was not convincing. Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer in October. He ordered that spectral evidence could no longer be used in witch trials. He created a new court, the Superior Court of Judicature, to handle the remaining cases. The new court, working under the new rules, found almost everyone not guilty. By May of 1693, Phipps had pardoned everyone still in prison. The machine stopped. 19 people hanged, 1 pressed to death, at least 5 dead in jail, hundreds imprisoned, thousands of lives disrupted by accusation, suspicion, and fear. And then, silence. The court stopped. The ministers moved on. The colony tried to resume normal life. There was a profound and collective desire to not talk about what had happened, to lower it into the past as quickly as possible and cover it over. It didn't work. It never works. 8. The Reckoning. How long it takes. January 14th, 1697. The Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and prayer for the tragedy of the Salem witch trials. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who had signed the death warrants, stood in his church while his pastor read a statement he had written, admitting his guilt, asking forgiveness from God and from the families of the victims. He stood in silence while it was read. He bore the blame, the statement said, and the shame of it. He was the only judge who ever publicly apologized. The General Court declared the trials unlawful. The colonial legislature passed a bill restoring the legal rights and reputations of some of the accused. Not all of them. 22 names were listed. Many were left out. The families of those listed received financial restitution, a total of £600 distributed among the heirs of the dead. £600 for 19 lives, 315 years after the trials. The Massachusetts legislature formally apologized and passed a resolution clearing the names of several more victims. The resolution mentioned Ann Pooteater and certain other persons, but did not list the other persons by name. Certain other persons. They could not even be named in the apology. More names cleared by legislative action. Elizabeth Johnson, Jr., convicted of witchcraft in 1693, was officially exonerated by the Massachusetts legislature. She was the last named victim still carrying a formal conviction. The effort to clear her name was led, in part, by a class of 8th grade civics students who discovered the oversight and decided to do something about it. It took 8th graders. It took 8th graders in 2022 to finish a piece of paperwork that should have been completed in 1693. 329 years. That is how long the city of Salem sat with an unrectified injustice on its books. Not because no one noticed, not because no one cared, because the process of reckoning with what had been done, of looking directly at it, naming it clearly, and correcting the record, was uncomfortable enough that it kept being deferred, generation after generation, century after century, until 8th graders made it a civics project. There is something about that fact that is more disturbing than any ghost story, more disturbing than any legend. A city that turned its worst moment into a tourist attraction before it finished apologizing for it. A city that built a witch museum and sold broomstick merchandise and hosted the largest Halloween festival in the world while some of the people it had killed were still legally guilty. That is the particular horror of Salem. Not that evil came here, but that ordinary people did terrible things here, and then spent 3 centuries finding ways to talk about those terrible things without fully facing them. 9. What the city became. At some point in the late 1800s, Salem made a decision. It was not an official decision. There was no vote, no proclamation, no moment of formal declaration. It was the kind of decision that happens slowly, through accumulated small choices, until one day you look up and realize that a direction has been set, and there is no turning back. Salem decided to be the witch city. The Salem Witch Museum opened in 1972 in a massive dark stone building on Washington Square North, a former church that looked exactly like what it had become, a place of ritual attention to something dark and old. It presented the witch trials through dramatic life-size dioramas, with narration and lighting and the kind of careful staging that turns history into experience. It became one of the most visited museums in New England. Hundreds of thousands of people a year walked through its doors. The witch decal appeared on police cars. Witch imagery showed up on the sides of buildings. The Essex Street pedestrian mall filled with shops selling crystals and tarot cards and spellbooks and broomsticks and various items described as magical. Ghost tours began operating. Haunted houses opened each October. Psychics and clairvoyants set up shops in the old buildings along the main streets. By the 1980s, a real Wiccan community had established itself in Salem, practicing witches, in the modern pagan sense of the word, who lived and worked in the city and were part of its civic fabric. They were not the same as the accused witches of 1692, who were not witches at all but ordinary people destroyed by accusation. But their presence added a layer to the city's identity that was genuine and complicated and not easily summarized. And then, in 1982, the city of Salem launched the first Haunted Happenings Festival, Halloween weekend, family events, about 50,000 people. It grew. By the 2000s, it was a month-long event, drawing hundreds of thousands. By the 2010s, more than 1 million visitors came to Salem in October. The streets were packed. Hotels were booked months in advance. The city had to implement special traffic management systems and satellite parking lots and ferry services from Boston to handle the volume. Salem had become the Halloween capital of America, perhaps the world. And here is the question that nobody asks loudly enough. What does it mean to celebrate, in the most festive and commercially successful way possible, in the very place where people were killed for being accused of exactly the thing you are celebrating? The witch shops are on Essex Street. The memorial to the hanged is also on Essex Street. You can buy a novelty broomstick and walk 2 blocks and stand in front of the names of 19 people who died because someone pointed at them and said witch. The city knows this. The people who live there year-round know this. Many of them have complicated feelings about it, feelings that don't fit neatly into either celebration or condemnation. Salem is a real city where real people live and work and pay taxes and raise children and go to school. The tourism economy that the Halloween festival generates is genuinely important to those people. The history is genuinely important to them. The complexity is genuine, but the discomfort is genuine too. Frank DeLuca, who spent 11 years as a historical consultant at the Salem Witch Museum, stopped going into the building after dark. He won't say exactly why. He says it differently each time he's asked. But what he always comes back to is this. There's something in that building that doesn't feel like history. It feels like something that's still happening. Nina Harlow, who comes to Proctor's Ledge once a week, says it another way. I come because I think someone should come and not treat it like an attraction. These were real people. Real people. That phrase, so simple, so obvious, is the thing that Salem has to keep reminding itself of. Because the particular danger of turning tragedy into tourism, of selling broomsticks 2 blocks from the memorial, is that the distance between real people and historical figures can shrink in ways that are very convenient for everyone who wants to feel the thrill without feeling the weight. Walk through Salem in October. Not in the day, when the streets are full and the energy is festive and the costumes are clever and the lines are long and everything feels like a very well-organized party. Walk through Salem at night, after the crowds have thinned, after the ghost tours have passed through, after the last ferry from Boston has docked and the late visitors are drifting back to their hotels. Find Proctor's Ledge. It is still there after the crowds leave. The street noise fades at its boundary in a way that is specific to that place, as if the sound knows where to stop. The granite slabs in the ground carry the names whether you are looking at them or not. The trees lean over them. The sky above the ledge on a clear October night is deep and black and full of cold stars. Stand there for a while. There is a quality to the silence at Proctor's Ledge that is different from ordinary silence. It is the kind of silence that has been accumulating for a long time. 3 centuries of people standing in that place and trying to understand what happened and what it means, and whether understanding is even possible for a thing this large. Walk back toward the center of the city along Charter Street, past the Charter Street Cemetery, the oldest cemetery in Salem, Puritan headstones with carved death's heads and hourglasses, and the epitaphs of people who were alive when the trials happened, who were neighbors and witnesses and participants and victims, whose bones are in the ground directly beneath you as you walk. John Hathorne is buried there. Judge John Hathorne, the magistrate who presided over the preliminary examinations with a ferocity that later historians have described as prosecutorial to the point of cruelty, who never apologized, who died without apparently experiencing any recorded regret for what he had done, who is the great-great-grandfather of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was so haunted by his ancestors' role in the trials that he added a W to his surname to distance himself from the family name, and who processed his inherited guilt through a body of work that includes The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables, both soaked in the particular atmosphere of Puritan Massachusetts and its capacity for communal cruelty dressed as righteousness. Hawthorne's grave is there, a flat stone marker, his name, his dates. The graves of some of his victims are not there, because convicted witches were not given proper burial. Their families took their bodies in secret, in the night, and buried them in unmarked places. Rebecca Nurse's family buried her on her own property in Danvers. The location of most of the others is unknown. The executed dead of Salem's summer of 1692 are in the ground somewhere in Essex County, in places that don't have markers. Their accuser is in the city's oldest cemetery. They are not. That arrangement, that particular distribution of who got a grave and who didn't, was set in 1692 and has not been fully corrected. The memorial at Proctor's Ledge has their names, but names in a park are not the same as bodies in consecrated ground. They were denied that, and they are still denied it, because the locations of the burials are still mostly unknown. There is a version of Salem's story where the horror ended in 1693 when the governor stopped the trials, where the injustice was contained to a specific period in history, mourned at a proper distance, corrected as thoroughly as any 3-century-old injustice can be corrected, and then left in the past where history lives. That version exists. It is available. People choose it. But there is another version, and it is harder to look at directly. In this version, what happened in Salem in 1692 was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of something, of what fear can do when it is given authority, of what certainty can do when it is not required to face evidence, of what ordinary people can do to each other when the system that is supposed to protect them decides instead to weaponize their vulnerability. That version does not stay in 1692. That version has no particular address. It shows up again and again across American history, wearing different clothes but carrying the same structure. A community in fear, an authority that channels that fear into accusation, a process that substitutes spectacle for evidence, and ordinary people, not monsters, never monsters, doing terrible things to each other because the system told them it was right and necessary, and the alternative was to admit that something had gone very wrong. Arthur Miller knew this in 1953, when he wrote The Crucible as an allegory for McCarthyism, the anti-communist witch hunts that were, in his moment, destroying careers and lives through accusation and spectral evidence, and the same machine that had run in Salem 260 years earlier. He was right then. He is right now. The play is still performed. The parallel is never not available. Salem is not a warning that was issued and heard and acted on. Salem is a warning that was issued and heard and set aside and keeps having to be issued again. The fog comes every year. It comes off Salem Harbor in October, the same way it has come every October for as long as anyone has been keeping track. It settles into the low places first, the spaces between the old houses, the hollows along the waterfront, the area around Proctor's Ledge where the ground dips slightly before the slope. It moves through the city slowly, not blown, not driven, just flowing from low to high the way water flows, following the paths of least resistance. The trees are bare by the end of the month. Their branches make the same shapes they have always made against the October sky, reaching, interlocking, the kind of shapes that the human eye is wired to interpret as figures, as forms, as something that might be moving if you look away and look back quickly. The tourists come, more than 1 million of them. They come with their costumes and their cameras and their genuine delight and their genuine curiosity and their Halloween spirit, and they fill the streets and the shops and the restaurants and the ghost tours and the museums, and the city accommodates them because the city has learned to accommodate them, because this is what Salem does in October now and has done for decades. And underneath all of it, underneath the tourists and the ghost tours and the gift shops and the festivals and the witch museums, the city continues to be what it has always been, a place where something happened, a place where the weight of what happened is still in the stones and the soil and the cold October air that comes in off the harbor at night when the crowds have gone back to their hotels, a place where a 4-year-old was put in chains because someone was afraid, a place where an 80-year-old man said more weight and meant it, a place where 19 people walked to a ledge on a summer and fall morning and did not walk back, a place where their names are carved in granite now, better than nothing, less than enough, while their graves are unknown and their accuser's stone sits in the oldest cemetery in the city, flat and certain and permanent, the way certainty always is. Salem does not ask you to be afraid of it. It doesn't need to. It just asks you to pay attention, to notice the quality of the silence at Proctor's Ledge after the crowds leave, to think for just a moment about what it means that the last convicted witch in Salem was exonerated in 2022 by middle school students because the adults had found other things to do. To consider that the horror of this place is not in the ghost stories, though the ghost stories are here and they are easy to find. The horror is in the facts. The plain, documented, archived, unambiguous facts of what people did to each other in this city in 1692, and how long it took to begin to answer for it, and whether the answer is finished yet. Walk through Salem in October. Let the fog come in. Listen to what the stones remember. They remember everything. They always do.